Hi everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Eric, the Investigative Millennial, and today we're going to be talking about Catholics versus Protestants. Now here's the thing. I know that Protestantism and Catholicism are not monolithic. There are different Catholics who do believe different things or articulate things differently, and there are different Protestants that articulate their beliefs differently. So if I say anything that is true about Catholicism and it's not true for you individually, or if I say something with Protestantism, please don't take it personal. Again, if the shoe doesn't fit, don't wear it. All I'm trying to do is to help us have better conversations with each other. And in this video, we're going to talk about 7 different ways in which things are going wrong and what we should do instead. So for the sake of this discussion, I am going to define Protestantism as it was historically defined as a person who believes that we are saved by grace through faith alone in Jesus Christ. And on the other hand, Catholicism, traditional Catholicism, which is people who believe that we are saved, again, by Jesus Christ, but that there are works that also must be included in order to get into heaven. So, of course, when people of these differing beliefs interact with each other, there are many ways the conversation can go wrong, which is why we have 7 ways that we can prevent some of these problems and we can make progress. Number 1, stop assuming that the other person is either illiterate, stupid, or evil. Basically, stop assuming the worst about people. There are many people who have studied the Bible, church history, and countless topics in the biblical studies department, but are still coming to different conclusions. Now, just to be clear, I have done many hours of study and many years of study on this topic of salvation, and I've been listening to different points of view, and I did a nearly 2-hour-long discussion on this topic that you can find in my link below. So, I am not wishy-washy on what I believe. I am an unapologetic proponent of grace through faith alone, and I will defend that position. That being said, though, while I do believe that I was saved long before I articulated any of these rebuttals, this study has basically given me more assurance, and it was a lot of work. The Bible even states in 2 Peter that some of Paul's letters are hard to understand, and that some people who are not taught distort them to their own destruction. So we need to be humble and slow to speak whenever we're talking about this. We should not get overconfident and think, well, I can't possibly be wrong on this, or anything else like that. If people back then could get it wrong, so can we. Now, I'm not trying to doom and gloom anybody. It is discoverable, the truth is available to those who seek it. But again, we do need to approach with humility. After all, if we both say, well, they're clearly wrong, and this one's clearly wrong, well, then we're both going to think, well, they're both clearly wrong, and then we're just going to go off and we're not going to get anywhere. Number 2 is that even Peter and the apostles in the early church massively struggled with this issue related to the gospel in the book of Acts. Let's take a look at Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. Now, some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved." This brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. This made all the brothers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. Then some of the believers, who belonged to the party of the Pharisees, stood up and said, "The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses." And verse 6 says, "The apostles and elders met to consider this question." Now you can see in verse 5, it clearly says believers said this. So the Bible, the narrator, Luke himself, calls them believers. So despite the fact that they affirmed something that in the book of Galatians, chapter 1, would have categorized them under a different gospel, that anyone who preaches another gospel among them other than the one that Paul preached and the other apostles preached, let them be accursed. Now, that's a very clear and direct statement. The Judaizers, as they were called, said, "You must be circumcised in order to be saved." Now, Paul cursed them. Now, it's huge. Now, there are different ways to reconcile this. For example, we could have said that the Judaizers were just more knowledgeable than the other believers in Acts 15, and thus they were held to a greater standard, and thus, while God may have extended some mercy to the lack of knowledge among the believers in Acts 15, he would not extend that same thing to the Judaizers in Galatians 1. If that's the case, we should be open to the fact that perhaps there may be some Catholics who are saved, and if you're a Catholic, likewise you can consider that, yes, there may be some Protestants that are saved, simply, again, because God is merciful and not all of us have the same degree of knowledge. Now, my position is very unambiguous. While I do believe we are saved by grace through faith alone, and that if you do that, you can be certain that you are saved, there are some believers, I believe, in the Catholic Church and other different churches. This would also apply to the Orthodox as well. While I will admit that I can't guarantee that they are saved, I'm not dismissive of the possibility because, again, biblically, I think we can at least be open to the possibility that they are. If anybody asks me what the gospel is, I won't hesitate to tell them what I think. And this won't make me any less strident in preaching it or affirming it. But again, I think we can at least grant some grace to people who may not fully articulate the gospel in what we think is the correct way. If Peter is able to get some things wrong on this subject, and they discussed it, as we just read in verse 6, you'd think that if anybody would have had an immediate, ready answer to all the nitty-gritty of the gospel, and would be held to probably the highest standard that we would ever hold anybody to, you'd think that Peter would be it. But he didn't. So if God can grant mercy to people who had probably the highest level of knowledge that a human being can have, and even there's some mercy, are we really so closed off to the idea that that maybe God may grant some mercy to people who have, who are 2,000 years later after the events. Because again, using the biblical principle of to whom much is given, much is required. However, let's say you disagree and you think that, well, it was a one-time thing or something, and you think that now everybody has to affirm grace through faith alone or something like that. Even if you disagree with my conclusion in number 2, I would still encourage you to employ the principles that I showed you in point 1, which is to be slow to speak and quick to listen, just as the book of James says, and to come at each other in discussion without overconfidence and arrogance and thinking the other person is just stupid or can't read. Number 3 is that we have to remember Catholics and Protestants are not monolithic. Many people will often write off some other person by a specific label that they go by without really understanding the nitty-gritty about what they believe. Many people who identify as Catholic believe that salvation is by grace through faith alone. Now, we can, again, say that maybe they shouldn't call themselves Catholic or something else. That's a legitimate discussion to have. But if there is some confusion among labels, then we need to judge people by the substance of their beliefs rather than what they call themselves. Because, after all, the Bible doesn't say you have to call somebody a Protestant in order to be saved. And in fact, ironically enough, some Protestants, there are many Protestants who believe that while we are saved by grace, there are things that you can do to lose your salvation. There are many who say, well, if you adopt this repetitive, perpetual sinful lifestyle, then you can forfeit God's grace. There are Protestants who believe you can never lose your salvation, but that if you are saved, you will do X, Y, and Z, and you could do a bunch of other things that are right, but if you adopt one sinful lifestyle, like in one area, then you could question whether you're saved or not. There are many different nuances and articulation to what somebody believes. And we need to be careful and get the substance of what they believe. In the book of Revelation, chapter 3, Jesus says that these people, the Church of Sardis, had a reputation for being alive, but that they were dead. But yet, he said, and this is in chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me, dressed in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out his name from the book of life, but will acknowledge his name before my Father and his angels. It was possible to be in a church and still not believe the individual doctrines that were poisonous, and Jesus said he would never blot out their name from the Lamb's Book of Life. So that's something we need to remember. Point number 4. That is the fact that Protestants are not just anybody who isn't Catholic and Orthodox. For example, there was an interview quite a while ago now with Brandon Robertson and Trent Horn. Brandon Robertson has on numerous occasions had theology that would put him at odds with Protestantism. He is not a Protestant. He is a progressive. Protestantism does have things that define it, that you can't, that again, it's really essential to get right, and unfortunately, Brandon Robertson, in particular, doesn't get some of those things right. While we aren't above questioning things, there are certain lines that we do believe and hold to with all conviction. Just keep them in mind about that, whether you end up agreeing with us or not. Number 5, objective and unbiased research is needed. Now, nobody can be fully perfect, but we should try to minimize whatever biases we might have as much as possible. Now, there are many things that people will say, for example, on all sides that aren't true. Many people will say that nobody until, the Reformation believed in grace through faith alone. And that just isn't true. For example, Marius Victorinus, a very early convert to Christianity, believed, again, in the grace through faith alone. Again, that doesn't mean he's necessarily right, but to say that the doctrine just came out of thin air is wrong. The Reformers quoted not just the Bible, they also referenced church fathers and many other people. So, we do need to be careful about just accepting what certain leaders say if we want it to be true. The 6th point is, God may have a purpose in not giving us all the information all the time. Certainly with regards to secondary issues, we can definitely debate and talk about them. Things like the Immaculate Conception and many other doctrines like that. And we can definitely, debate them with strong opinions. But again, we have to consider that the Lord doesn't give us all the information at one time for a reason. 1 Corinthians 13 flat out says we see through a mirror dimly. And that's for people who have prophecy, which is a supernatural gift. So how much more would that apply to people who may not have that gift but merely study things in a traditional sense, like going to a seminary? So, after all, do we really even want to have all the same beliefs? Do we really want to be some Borg collective that just repeats the same things over and over again? I don't think so. Honestly, I think that would get boring and, honestly, a little creepy at times. Yes, we want to figure out these issues, but we can have fun at the same time. And lastly, this centers around God's mercy, but Jesus Christ's mercy is so overpowered and ridiculously overpowered that it's not even funny. Now, obviously, I am well aware of God's wrath, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. 1 Corinthians 11, 27, verse 32 say this, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. And a man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many among you are sick and weak, and a number of you have fallen asleep," which means they died. "But if we judged ourselves, we would not come under judgment. Still, when we are judged by the Lord in this way, we are being disciplined so that we will not be condemned with the world." Now think about that for a second. If some people have been, and some of them were sick and just were punished with sickness, some of them had even died, meaning that they died committing a sin against the body and blood of the Lord. In many translations, they say they will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord, essentially just as though you participate in killing him. I can't think of a worse sin than being guilty of Jesus's blood. If he was merciful to people and they were judged so they would not be condemned, Do you really think he would send somebody to hell over something that is different than that? I mean, I don't know. That seems a little off to me, and we should not lose sight of God's mercy. So, I implore you to trust Christ. Anyway, those are my 7 points. Thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you all very soon in the next video.